welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson and I'm a professor of English at Stanford University. In the next few episodes, I will be paying attention to the representation of race in various literary texts. But today, I want to focus specifically on Shakespeare's Othello and to ask the question, at what point does Othello realize that he's Black? Now, every character in the play is obliged to respond to the inescapable social fact of Othello's Blackness, including Othello himself. In the opening scene, many negative epithets about his Blackness are said behind his back by Iago and Rodrigo, and the disdain in them is quite clear. Thick lips, old black ram, devil, lascivious, Barbary horse, and various other negative epithets. However, what is surprising is Othello's almost steadied non-response to any references to his Blackness, either in positive or negative terms, throughout Act 1. He already shows signs of this apparent non-response in Act 1, Scene 2, when Brabantio's search team finally finds him on that rowdy opening night. Othello had earlier been met by a different search team led by Cassio, one of 3 teams dispatched from the Senate in desperate quest to find him so that they could give him his military commission for Cyprus. The very first thing that Brabantio says when he claps eyes on Othello is, "Down with him, thief!" Upon which both sides draw their swords. Brabantio continues to cast even worse aspersions on Othello by accusing him of enchanting Desdemona and binding her in chains of magic. He asks how his daughter could have run to, quote, the sooty bosom of such a thing as thou, to fear, not delight. Further adding that Othello is, quote, a practicer of arts inhibited and out of warrant. Since Othello has indeed married Brabantio's daughter without her father's knowledge or consent, it is perhaps not surprising that at this point he does not respond directly to these accusations and insults, but rather tries to diffuse Brabantio's anger and the obvious threat of violent conflict between the 2 search parties. "Keep up your bright swords, for the dew will rust them. Good Signor, you shall more command with years than with your weapons." If at the heart of Brabantio's accusations is the idea that Othello must have deployed magical means to engender irrational romantic choices in Desdemona against her natural disposition, it is also evident that Othello does not react to this particular description of him as a Black man, but only responds with poise and self-restraint to what appears to the audience as a blatant, racially charged provocation. Brabantio's negative description of Othello's Blackness continues when they arrive before the Senate, and even though he does not directly use the epithet Black in laying out his accusation before the Duke, Its earlier implications of supernatural activity hang in the air from repetition. Brabantio. She is abused, stolen from me, and corrupted by spells and medicines, but of mountebanks. For nature so preposterously to err, being not deficient, blind, or lame of sense, sans witchcraft could not. And yet again, there is no direct response to this accusation from Othello. In fact, the eloquent story he tells of how he won Desdemona's love is significant for appealing to everyone's natural disposition to sympathize with a tale of woe and tribulation. It scrupulously disconfirms any idea of blackness as attached to his adventures at all. And this is what we see. Othello, most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my very noble and approved good masters, that I have taken away this old man's daughter, it is most true. I have married her. The very head and front of my offending hath this extent, no more. Rude am I in speech, and little blessed with the soft phrase of peace. For since these arms of mine had 7 years' pith, till now some 9 moons wasted, they have used their dearest action in the tented field, and little of this great world can I speak, more than pertains to feats of broil and battle. And therefore, little shall I grace my cause in speaking for myself. Yet, by your gracious patience, I will a round and varnished tale deliver of my whole course of love, what drugs, what charms, what conjuration, and what mighty magic. For such proceeding I'm charged withal. I won his daughter. Still Othello. Her father loved me, oft invited me, still questioned me the story of my life. From year to year, the battles, sieges, fortunes that I have passed, I ran it through, even from my boyish days to the very moment that he bade me tell it, wherein I spoke of disastrous chances, of moving accidents by flood and field, of hairbreadth escapes in the imminent deadly breach, of being taken by the insolent foe and sold to slavery, of my redemption thence, and portents in my traveler's history, wherein of antres vast and deserts idle, rough quarries, rocks and hills whose heads touch heaven, it was my hand to speak. Such was my process, and of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagy, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. This to hear would Desdemona seriously incline, but still the house affairs would draw her thence, whichever as she could with haste dispatch, she'd come again, and with a greedy ear devour my discourse, which I, observing, took once a pliant hour, and found good means to draw from her a prayer of earnest heart, that I would all my pilgrimage dilate, whereof by parcels she had something heard, but not intentively. I did consent, and often did beguile her of her tears, when I did speak of some distressful stroke that my youth suffered. My story being done, she gave me for her pains a world of sighs. She swore in faith. It was strange. It was passing strange. It was pitiful. It was wondrous pitiful. She wished she had not heard it. Yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. She thanked me and bade me, if I had a friend that loved her, I should but teach him how to tell my story, and that would woo her. Upon this hint, I spake. She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. This only is the witchcraft I used. Now, beyond the evidence of his extraordinary storytelling powers is the fact that Othello is here also divulging important information about his life course up to the point of this telling. And yet, none of the events he described are exclusively within the realm of experience necessarily or exclusively of a black man in the period. The information about the landscapes he has traversed since childhood not only indicates a life of precarity and of travailous history, which is troublesome history, but also his passage through different topographies. Slavery, the antres vast, which is large caves, deserts idle, cannibals, and anthropophagy are added to accidents by flood and field and fierce deeds of battle to define various counter social spaces. The spaces that Othello has been obliged to traverse are spaces actively designed to destroy society and social relations, but they do not necessarily prove that he's black. Since slavery during the Renaissance period was not limited to black people, but also encompassed white Europeans, Othello's story has a double edge to it. On the one hand, it signals a default understanding of the fate of blackness because of the word slavery. But on the other, it shows how that fate might have happened to anyone, irrespective of their race. In fact, historians have shown that in 1854, a raid of the southern Italian town of Vieste captured 6,000 white people who were then taken as slaves to North Africa. An Algerian raid of the Bay of Naples took another 7,000 in the same year, driving the price of slaves so low that it was said that a Christian could be swapped for an onion. Entire Adriatic coastal regions were depopulated on fear of Turkish slave raids, making Othello's story equally applicable to Black Africans as well as white Europeans in the period. The mention of the anthropophagy also orients Othello's account toward exoticism rather than specifically to blackness. Anthropophagy were first written about by Herodotus in the histories and by Pliny the Elder in the history of the natural world, where they are described as one of several tribes that lived near Scythia. But Scythia was not in Africa. In classical antiquity, it was a region thought to encompass Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe along the Black Sea. This would place the anthropophagy anywhere in the general area of today's Bulgaria, Georgia, Moldova, and even Russia. The legend of the anthropophagy being from Scythia was repeated in 1550 in Richard Sherry's very fruitful exposition. Quote, they say there be people not far from Scythia, which of eating man's flesh be called anthropophagy, that is, devourers of men. John Marston also mentions them in his The Metamorphosis of Pygmalion's Image in Certain Satires in 1598. And a year before Othello's first performance in 1603 1604, the anthropophagy had also been attributed to Brasilia, that is South America, in Robert Broughton's first part of the Resolution of Religion. It is Richard Hakluyt who places the anthropophagy in Africa in his principal navigations, a source considered to have been directly relevant to Shakespeare's portrait. But it is clear from the overall cultural genealogy of the term that they were considered of variant vintage and the placeholders for exotic and strange lands. Now, conventionally, Othello's reference to his redemption from slavery is interpreted as a dual reference to his freedom and his conversion to Christianity. But there are good grounds to suspect that it may also have been referring to his entry into Venice as a soldier recruit attached to a particular military household. This would have been entirely consistent with how slaves were inserted into Venetian society in the period, either as servants or slaves, and then trained to take on the primary profession of their masters, with the boundary between servants and slaves often being blurred in the course of their professionalization. Thus, entailed in Othello's identity as he describes it to the Duke and the senators is that he has no geographical or cultural anchor to his being, except for what he derives from his understanding of the customs of Venice. And clearly, the customs of Venice have been so well absorbed by him that it shows in his very mellifluous rhetorical capabilities. Of course, the idea of lack of a clear cultural provenance is somewhat contradicted for us later in the account he gives of the faithful handkerchief to his wife Desdemona in Act 3, Scene 4, where he states that it was given to his mother by an Egyptian and that it had magic in it to subdue his father. But in his speech before the Senate, Othello seems to be implying that he is black only as they like to see him, but not through his cultural provenance, life course, or even cultural orientation. Othello's first acquiescence to a negative idea of his blackness comes after Iago insinuates that there is something odd in Desdemona not choosing the quote, many proposed matches of her own clime, complexion, and degree, where we see in all things nature tends. Close quotation. When Iago exits at the end of that exchange, Othello begins to itemize his own defects in a soliloquy. And it is in this itemization that he explicitly concedes to a form of blackness. And this is the first time in the play. Othello, haply, for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have, or for I am declined into the vale of years. Yet that not much. She's gone. I am abused. and my relief must be to loathe her. Of course, this comes after Iago has worked his poison on him, made him increasingly more jealous that Desdemona must be having an affair with Cassio, and Othello is totally losing his mind. Now, in this brief soliloquy, while there's no logical connection between what he says, I am black, and not having the suaveness of what the Venetian chamberers have, and also being much older than his new bride, the upshot of all these is that Othello now feels crucial. Othello now feels strongly that his identity as a black person marks an essential cultural deficit. It's the first time throughout the play that he has admitted, first, that he's black, and B, that his blackness is the marker of a deficit. Even though his immediate reaction in this soliloquy is to loathe Desdemona, the deficit he is describing here is not the same as the moral deficit that Brabantio attributes to him in Act 1, which, as we recall, was accusations of magic and nefarious means of winning his daughter's hand. Here, the question seems to be more that of his comparative lack of cultural know-how and savoir-faire, something that he assumes the Venetian chamberers have in abundance. The sense of lack stands in odd contrast to the pride he draws from his military achievements and his service to the state in the scene before the Senate. Less than 100 lines later, the confusion in Othello's mind about his feelings toward Desdemona is declared in what commentators have noted as a clear species of self-loathing. Othello, by the world, I think my wife be honest, and think she's not. I think thou art just, and think thou art not. I'll have some proof. Her name, that was as fresh as Diane's visage, is now begrimed and black as my own face. If there be cords or knives, poison or fire, or suffocating streams, I will not endure it. Would I were satisfied. Now, as we shall see next week in a discussion of Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, one of the effects of colonial racial ideology was to distort the schema of the black body. And in a multicultural environment such as the Venice of Othello, where he is a racial minority amongst Venetians who are predominantly white, the distortions to his bodily schema are entailed in the saturation of the social sphere with negative stereotypes of blackness as being synonymous with different kinds of deficit. In short, of blackness being equated to barbarity and backwardness. Othello's reference to his face as being begrimed and black is a meta-theatrical reference to the tradition of blackface that white performers of his character used until well into the 19th century. But it also refers to the sense of disruption of his bodily schema, as Fanon describes it, and we shall see more of Fanon next week. There are, however, a number of significant differences we will find between what Fanon describes and what we see in Othello. For as we have seen, when the negative attributes of blackness are held in his face by Brabantio in Act 1, Othello scrupulously refuses to respond to their central premise of barbarism and civilizational deficit. His sense of being remains whole and undisturbed throughout Act 1. The problem emerges when he begins to compare himself to others, first to younger Venetian men and then to Desdemona herself. It is in this vice-like grip of comparisons, which are first suggested by Iago, but that Othello then takes upon himself, that he acquiesces to the declaration of his blackness as a form of lack. After this acquiescence, the admission of a cultural lack is progressively replaced by forms of irrational thinking and behavior that eventually confirm the original suspicions of barbarism hurled by Brabantio to his face and whispered behind his back by Iago and Rodrigo. Even if the admission of cultural lack is not the same as the admission of barbarism on the part of Othello, the first, that is cultural lack, is embraced as a form of self-generated belief as he compares himself to others. While the second, though originally refuted through his beautiful storytelling, is enacted in the choices that he makes when his masculinity is threatened. In other words, he refutes originally the sense of cultural lack, but then invokes it for himself in comparing himself to others. And then barbarism and kind of lack of civilizational self-control is enacted in the choices that he makes in his sense of a threatened masculinity. Othello's surrender to what we will later see in other Shakespeare texts as an unruly affective economy eventually undoes all that he values and treasures, including his true wife and his good name. And so we see in Shakespeare's play that Othello seems to arrive quite late to a conception of his blackness. It is not in his own consciousness, at least not throughout Act 1. And that this consciousness is the product of comparison, of comparing himself to younger white Venetian men and finding himself suddenly lacking. The fact that this comparison takes place as part of the process of his having to confront the threat to his masculinity, or what he considers the threat to his masculinity, also means that what Othello expresses is a dual articulation of toxic masculinity attached to his blackness. And as we shall see in forthcoming episodes, the exact context in which blackness is expressed also come to inflect the directions of how blackness might be defined. Thank you very much. Please subscribe and share. Hit the notifications bell so you don't miss any forthcoming episodes. And write your comments in the section below. See you next week.